With that, it's time now for our next session.
Okay.
And we have with us Dr. Manish Gupta, who's Director of Google Research India AI Lab. He holds an additional appointment as Infosys Foundation Chair Professor at IIIT Bangalore. Previously, Manish has led VideoKen, a video technology startup, and the research centers for Xerox and IBM in India. As a senior manager at IBM TJ Watson Research Center in Yorktown Heights, New York, Manish led the team developing system software for the Blue Gene L supercomputer. IBM was awarded a National Medal of Technology and Innovation for Blue Gene by US President Barack Obama in 2009. Manish holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has co-authored about 75 papers with more than 7,000 citations in Google Scholar and has been granted 19 US patents. While at IBM, Manish received two Outstanding Technical Achievement Awards, an Outstanding Innovation Award, and the Lou Gerstner Team Award for Client Excellence. Manish is a fellow of ACM and the Indian National Academy of Engineering and a recipient of a Distinguished Alumnus Award from IIT Delhi. Here to speak on human-inspired artificial intelligence, Dr. Manish Gupta. Over to you, sir.
Uh, Thanks, Anvit. Can I share my screen? I was unable to do that.
You can do so now, sir. Please.
Now I can see. Okay.
Your screen is visible and you are audible, sir.
Okay. So I appreciate this opportunity. So I'll be talking about, again, human-inspired artificial intelligence. So as we enter this era where computing and in particular artificial intelligence, right, is beginning to impact all aspects of how the world is run. You see healthcare, you see agriculture, sustainability, you see the impact of AI pretty much across different verticals. And as we begin to use AI to influence and touch human lives, it becomes really important to understand some of the human factors. So today, I'll talk about some of the work that our team has been doing in this area. I'll talk about data. How do you deal with data that comes from humans? How do you model human behavior? And how do you influence human behavior, right? Which is even harder. And I'll talk about these aspects in the context of two different application areas of AI. One is healthcare, the other is democratizing access to information. So let's start with looking at data from humans. So I'll start by talking about the work that's been done by our HCI team. And in fact, they presented a paper at the CHI conference this year where they got the Best Paper Award. What they pointed out as they did this study through interviews with a number of practitioners of AI, as well as they looked at how data gets, so data is usually the foundation on top of which is used to build machine learning models. And what they recognized was that even though data is the foundation, often that gets neglected. There's much more glamorization, right, of this whole modeling, the ML models that you build once you get the data. There's not enough attention paid to the quality of data that you're getting, which is the basis, right, for these models. So what they, what they pointed out is that this leads to potentially very serious problems that they refer to as data cascades down the road as you build these AI models and as you apply these AI models to real world applications. So some of the problems that they identified, which they refer to as data cascades, are things like interacting with physical world brittleness, where often the data that you are using to train your models is quite pristine, it's been cleansed, whereas the data that the models will be handling in the real world is often very messy. And often that data in the real world and in production its distribution may depart from the distribution of, again, the data that was used to train the models, right, which leads to these serious issues. Another problem that they identified was inadequate application domain expertise while annotating that data. And this becomes especially important, and this problem is especially acute in cases like healthcare, where often you require very significant medical domain expertise in order to even label the data. And one of the issues that you often see is you see differences of opinion amongst even qualified doctors on what this case really represents, how bad is the condition, right, corresponding to a given case. And the problem becomes much worse if you apply insufficient expertise while annotating that data. Then there are also issues in conflicting reward systems sometimes, again, because of the people who are collecting the data and annotating the data are not adequately rewarded for quality. Often it leads to, again, poor choices and issues like poor cross-organizational documentation, because often the organization which is generating the data might be very different from the organization that is annotating the data, which is different from the organization that is using the data to build those machine learning models, which is again different from the organization which is ultimately the intended beneficiary of those ML models. So what this team identified is that there are, again, because of inadequate attention to many of these issues, it leads to all these problems that they call cascades downstream, which often require you to either kind of restart the process, for instance, the modeling process, or sometimes abandon it entirely. So what this work pointed out is the need for really an urgent structural change in how AI research and development gets done, in particular to incentivize care in data excellence. And sure enough, in one of our projects, so we have this initiative on AI for social good, where we look at, again, applying AI to problems in contexts where these can help disadvantaged communities that haven't traditionally benefited as much from computing. And we launched this program in partnerships with various nonprofits, which were tackling problems for various communities. And they posed to us problems that were meaningful, which required AI to address, tackle those problems. And one of these organizations, Khushi Baby, which is working again on improving maternal and child health, and they have a significant deployment in the state of Rajasthan in India. They told us that the fundamental problem that they are facing is that the data that is collected by the healthcare workers, it tends to be very noisy and error prone due to lack of diligence. So for instance, they've seen such phenomenon like if there are blood pressure readings of these expecting mothers, they all look suspiciously kind of normal, 120 by 80 or 110 by 70 and so on. And let's say weights of babies and so on. I mean, if there's a certain threshold below which there is more attention paid, and that is considered, like the baby is considered underweight, suspiciously, again, all of the readings seem to be above the threshold. So what they had previously done was to build kind of use hard-coded rules to try and maybe guess which data kind of looks okay and which data seems to be suspect. What our team did was to again apply ML methods to soften these hard rules. So instead of using these hard rules, we kind of look at probability of non-diligence, where we model. We still use these rules, but we use them to create, again, probability of non-diligence for each auxiliary nurse midwife. And then we do clustering to naturally try and separate out the diligent workers from the non-diligent workers. And again, here the goal was to ultimately provide training and the right kind of incentives to the non-diligent workers. And so there was a pilot that we ran after kind of building that model of non-diligence based on the data that we had, the historical data, and it showed reasonably good accuracy in terms of being able to classify the non-diligent workers. I'll now talk about, again, this, in the last few kind of minutes, I was talking about data that is coming from humans, where there is some kind of a potentially deliberate or whatever, there are issues in terms of quality of data, and sometimes some of that is deliberate or due to misaligned incentives. Now let me switch to a different context. In the context of democratizing access to information, we see, again, a certain different kinds of data issues. And the context here is that, again, as Google, our key mission is to organize the world's information and make it easily accessible and usable by people in the context of a country like India. So what happens is that today, those of us who are, for instance, attending this conference, we are amongst the privileged ones in India who are able to understand English as a language. And for us, it's very easy to, again, use our favorite search engine and get access to information on pretty much any topic that we are looking for. However, the mission that we took on was, so on the other hand, if you don't speak English, then things aren't as good for you. So the mission we wanted to take on was that, look, if what about that, let's say, farmer's son in Haryana or that laborer's daughter in Chhattisgarh? How do we provide her with access to close to the same level of information that you and I have access to? So look at India as a country. We see that we have a huge number of languages that we speak. So there are over 1,500 languages that get spoken in India. And there are 22 scheduled, or kind of informally called 22 official languages. And only about 11% of our country actually speaks English. So before I talk about how we support non-English speakers, let me first talk very briefly about how Google search engine, right? And how is AI being used today in, let's say, Google search engine to support information access for a speaker in English. And again, many of you may be familiar with this recent advance of transformer models, and in particular BERT, which has made a significant difference to the quality of search, let's say, by the Google search product. Because if you go back to the early days of the Google search engine, you had to have a very exact match. Let's say if you were doing a search for looking for a place to eat, so today, the search engine would understand that when you're saying looking for a place to eat, you're looking for a restaurant. Even if, let's say, the website of that restaurant doesn't have those keywords, place to eat, through these, again, NLP models, we are able to understand that, again, the intent here is when somebody is looking for a place to eat, the intent is to again look for, let's say, typically a restaurant. Now, the way BERT kind of models have been built are by, again, taking this large corpus of text, right, from sources like Wikipedia. And again, I mean, some of you may be familiar, but just a very quick kind of like a 1 minute primer on how BERT itself gets built. You basically mask out words, roughly 15% of the words from the original corpus. So let's say you mask out these words born, 2 years, and so on. And then you get this neural model to predict those missing words. So this reminds me of the exercise that our school teacher used to give us when we were studying English in school, that they would give us this exercise, fill in the blanks. And the teacher was trying to understand, basically test our understanding of the language, as well as our understanding of kind of reasoning from the context surrounding those blanked out words. So a similar thing happens here, where in order to correctly predict these words, BERT is forced to kind of learn some of the nuances of the language, and BERT also to predict these words looks at the context both from the preceding words as well as the following words, and that's where the B in BERT, bidirectional, comes from. That unlike LSTM models, which were built, so today you use all these LSTM models to predict the next word you're likely to type, for instance, right, in email or when you're typing things on your mobile device. LSTM models are looking essentially at the preceding words. BERT looks at both preceding as well as later words, and then it applies the transformer technique, where it is paying special attention to certain words which are going to be more, in some sense, influential in determining what this blank word is. So anyways, as you build these models, we have seen again techniques like BERT significantly improving the ability of our systems on various natural language processing tasks. Now, so now what I want to point out is that something like, let's say, the way BERT is done is not going to be sufficient for, let's say, dealing with access to information, right, in the Indian context. And one of the reasons is that you may have people, so that you are likely to encounter several words which don't even appear in the formal corpus. And you can look at, so just to illustrate that, I picked this menu card from a restaurant that one of our teams kind of found, and they use that as inspiration for their work. So this is the appetizer menu, and you can see that the way, again, I mean, it lists various items in Hindi, and then these items are also listed in English. And what you can see is that some of these items, let's say pineapple raita, the way pineapple has been spelled, no native English speaker, right, would spell it this way. But if you think about, again, how you might write the word pineapple in Hindi, and then you try to write it back in English, you can see that phonetically, because Hindi is a very phonetically consistent language, you can see that phonetically, this way of writing pineapple does make sense. What about this word appetizer? I mean, the way appetizer has been spelled, again, I mean, most of it phonetically makes sense, except that at the end, the sound z has been replaced by the sound j, because for many native Hindi speakers from certain regions, the Z sound is not there in the core language. And so the closest equivalent sound is the J sound. So that Z is getting replaced by J in that spelling. So the basic kind of insight here is that we have people who are misspelling these words influenced by their native language, by the native language influence. And further, there are phonetic variations influenced by the native language that may lead to further kind of variations in how they spell these words. So the reason this is important is that we do see queries, for instance, the kind that are shown on this left column in the Google search engine. So when there is a query like boys shoes, where shoes has been spelled this way, SHUJ, ideally you should understand the user's intent, that the user is looking for boys shoes, and likewise. So this was again led to this project called Indophoneme, and Arvind, who's my colleague, kind of came up with that initial observation where they wanted to model the reason behind some of these different ways of spelling and be able to understand the user intent, right, in these kinds of queries more effectively. The other thing that this team observed is that in addition to misspellings, this way of kind of looking at the problem could also help you improve your automatic speech recognition system. Because today, one of the known weaknesses of automatic speech recognition systems is that often they do not work well on speakers with a different accent, with various accent variations. So for instance, today, right, we have automatic speech recognition that works very well for a native English speaker with a, let's say, a US accent or a British accent. It may not work very well for a person, let's say, with my Indian accent. And it may work even worse for a person, let's say that when that farmer's son in Haryana starts speaking certain words of English, it may understand that person even less. So what this team started using Indophoneme for is also to use that concept to generate different phonetic variants, for instance, of the word shoes, and then using text-to-speech, generate different ways in which this word may be pronounced, influenced by different kind of native languages to make our speech recognition systems also more robust. So Indophoneme, again, the phoneme bias that it introduces from the language. I've already given you some example where the sound corresponding to Z may get replaced by kind of the sound corresponding to J. In Bengali, because often the original sound B it doesn't exist, the closest to that is the sound corresponding to B. So again, you are replacing again the word these letters V by the letter B, and then you do the phoneme to grapheme model to map these phonetic patterns to various spelling variations. And with this, again, we have been able to significantly kind of improve the ability of our query processing engine in being able to recognize different variants of the original English words when they appear as typed, part of typed queries. We are also working right now in using these synthesized versions in improving the automatic speech recognition capabilities. And again, and it's not just in kind of the spoken text or kind of the typed text. Another kind of set of problems arises when you look at handwritten text from humans. So if you look at, for instance, the example, so today in India, most of the, again, healthcare is provided by small clinics, not the major hospitals, and you have relatively low adoption of electronic health record systems in these clinics. So, and again, the key to applying AI to transform healthcare is ultimately to apply those models on electronic health records. But how do you get electronic health records in the first place? So our team has been looking at this problem of starting with the handwritten medical prescriptions, and the ultimate goal is to create the health record entry automatically from this handwritten prescription. We are very, very far from being able to do that effectively, because when we ran a very simple evaluation and from some of these typical handwritten prescriptions, applying state-of-the-art OCR, handwriting recognition, and OCR technologies, when we tried to see, could you correctly identify the medicine names from these prescriptions, we found that the accuracy levels were quite abysmal, of the order of 10 to 11%. So there's a lot of, again, kind of work to do. And on the other hand, when you look at the problem, there is a certain method to the madness, because you may see that this doctor has really organized this prescription in kind of these different regions. This region corresponds to body vitals. This region corresponds to observations. This region is where they have written down all the medicines. This has all the lab reports. So the question that our team is looking at is, as a starting point, can you automatically identify kind of those right clusters? And then can you, again, then further, and often those clusters correspond to kind of these different kind of themes, like observations or prescription of medicines, and prescription of medicines will follow a certain style, that there would be a medicine name, and then how frequently it is to be taken, and so on. But trying to do that automatically, it still remains a major challenge. Another, again, in the interest of time, let me kind of try to wrap up soon. Another problem that we've been looking at is, again, looking at low-cost smartphones. That when you see, again, users of these smartphones, you would like to support voice-based interactions and interactions in native language, which again leads to very, very serious challenges, because in addition to all of these problems that I've already mentioned, kind of supporting the rich diversity of languages and all of the different accents and so on, you have additional issues of things like, how do you honor the privacy of individuals? How do you run these models on the device? Because of reasons of privacy and network connectivity, you may not want to run those machine learning models on the cloud, and want to run as much of the AI functionality on the device itself. And that leads to, again, major challenges, because while a lot of these large machine learning models, they have shown great performance, they have to be distilled down to efficient enough models that can run on the limited compute resources, limited memory and limited compute resources of these mobile devices, especially low-end mobile devices. So that, again, presents a significant challenge. So let me, again, let me maybe just just spend a few minutes talking about additional issues that arise as you're modeling human behavior and also influencing human behavior. So to give you one example of, again, modeling human behavior, this is the work done by my colleagues, which were Pradeep Shenoy and Soumya, which was presented at AAAI conference this year, where, again, they built essentially deep learning based models to model human behavior. And they started with initially a very kind of a toy problem that we think of us humans as very rational thinkers, but in reality, we all carry a lot of biases, and often the way we make decisions, they reflect a lot of these biases. So correspondingly, there had been, again, cognitive scientists who had built certain, designed some carefully designed experiments and collected data that showed those biases. So in particular, there is this public data set from a very simple card game where the subjects are asked to, certain cards are closed and the subjects are asked to guess which row has the maximum product. And it turns out that the way and you're asked to either guess, or you can choose to spend some of your resources, some of your budget in opening, in saying that I want to open one of the closed cards to give me more information that allows me to guess. And they showed various biases, like when you frame the problem as a guessing the row with the maximum product versus minimum product, it changes. For when you have a card game with only 2 rows, the problem statement is identical, whether you have to choose the maximum product or minimum product, and yet we behave differently depending on the way the problem is posed. So that's kind of framing bias. Another bias that we show is that if I believe that row A is going to have the maximum product, I'm more likely to go for opening a card from row A rather than from row B, because that is kind of, and that often shows this kind of confirmation bias, where I'm looking for data that confirms something that I already believe. So this data that these scientists had collected showed those biases, and Pradeep and Soumya were able to build a deep learning model that not only showed those biases in aggregate, they were even able to predict individual behavior by doing this kind of coming up with these user embedding and doing that to do fine-grained clustering of subjects. And then with as few as like 5 to 10 data points on a given subject, they were able to predict. So the basic intuition is that, let's say, if this cluster, if this user embedding is placing me in a similar category, let's say as Pradeep, that I'm exhibiting many of the same biases as, let's say, Pradeep, then by utilizing the data that is already available for what Pradeep did on later tasks, this model is effectively able to predict what I'm likely to do on those tasks. So again, this is a very promising way to, again, model human behavior, which we are applying to areas like healthcare, where we are trying to, again, incentivize people towards healthy behaviors. And so I'll just spend maybe one last minute on this example, where we are looking at applying, again, AI-based models to problems of lifestyle diseases, right? So today, much of the burden, disease burden in the world is accounted for by lifestyle diseases like cardiovascular disease, which leads to, again, the highest number of people dying, both in India as well as the world at large. And many of these diseases are quite preventable. So in particular, if you look at, for instance, cardiovascular disease, where people die of heart attacks and strokes, that through simple kind of lifestyle changes, if people are physically active, they pay attention to their diet, limit the amount of sodium in their diet, increase the intakes of fruits and vegetables. They get the right amount of sleep, are able to reduce their level of stress. And if they still need medication, adhere to that medication. If you kind of adhere to these simple lifestyle practices, you can dramatically bring down your level of risk for adverse events like heart attacks and strokes. And today there are apps which today will help you individually take care of these kind of various aspects, various risk factors. And what we are doing with this project called Personalized Automated Lifestyle Suggestions is to, in a very personalized manner, automatically identify what's the right advice to give to an individual, A, which is likely to have the greatest impact on that person, and B, which the person is likely to listen to. Because I may be an individual who is reasonably okay with exercising, but I enjoy my food, so I'm unlikely to listen to advice on kind of food related items. On the other hand, somebody else may be okay with like paying with making changes to their diet, but are less inclined to do regular exercise and so on. And again, I mean, some of the biggest open issues here are how do you influence human behavior? Where again, I mean, today we are applying some of these ideas from theory of planned behavior, but this is a very, very kind of an interesting and open problem. So with that, let me conclude that data from humans tend to be messy, and data excellence requires a great deal of attention, greater attention, because that's the foundation of all of these AI models. And there are interesting issues that arise when we start looking at data that comes from humans that are listed here. And again, modeling human behavior is hard, and influencing human behavior is even harder. But again, I mean, as we tackle some of these problems, there are again huge opportunities for real world impact. So that let me stop and apologize for running over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manish. There are a couple of questions. Let's just try to take them if time permits. But the first question is, how data protection law influence is handled in this kind of large amount of data handling with multi-language and illiteracy?
Yeah, so a lot of data protection laws are about preserving the privacy of individuals. And which is the right thing to do. So it leads, I mean, I would say it definitely has a lot of impact often on the downstream tasks like modeling. Because if, let's say, you are not allowed to, let's say, collect all of the data, let's say in a centralized place, let's say just speech data, right? Let's say for looking at a concrete example. So today there are, again, I mean, techniques like, for instance, federated learning that was initially developed at Google Research. Today it is being used by many, many organizations where you do not make a copy of that data and you do not bring it to a centralized place. You try and run the distributed models, right, on the device, and then you try to do the learning in a federated manner across those devices. And it is well known that, again, when you go for federated learning, the level of accuracy, so there is both a penalty to be paid in terms of performance, and the level of accuracy that you get, right, in your machine learning models is again often there's a penalty, right, that you're paying. It is it is often well below the level of accuracy that you get if you were able to bring all of that data, right, in a centralized place. But again, I mean, you have to honor, right, the privacy considerations. And likewise, I mean, even when people look at, so for instance, differential privacy is a very popular technique, right, to support privacy of individuals. That again leads to often there is random noise being introduced. And again, I mean, often there is a penalty to be paid in terms of the quality of the models, right, that you're able to build. And again, that is a very active area of research, right? How do you close the gap between models that give you those privacy guarantees versus models that don't?
I believe we are way out of time at the moment. I'm going to hand over the session now to Fatima. Over to you, Fatima.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anvit. And with that, we would like to thank you, Doctor, for your time. And thank you for gracing this occasion. Thank you for gracing VLD21 with your glorious presence. It truly was an extremely, extremely educative session for all of us. So moving on now.